It was Tuesday, a few minutes past 10 in the morning, and Clarice had just turned off the heat under the pot where she was cooking pumpkin jam. Her cell phone vibrated on the kitchen counter, and a notification from the Ferreira family group appeared on the screen. The message, brief and surgical, read, "Guys, we think it's best for Mom to step away for a while." It was signed by Bernardo, her only son. A second later, the blue thumb of Viviane, her daughter-in-law, appeared. Clarice stood, motionless, the wooden spoon hovering over the steam, as the sweet aroma transformed into something sour. There were no shouts, no arguments, not even an explanation, just a sentence written in a decisive tone, as if announcing the cancellation of some family plan. She sat down slowly, placed her phone on the table, and felt something inside her snap with the same metallic sound the spoon made when it fell into the pot. What Bernardo called getting away for a while hadn't been born that morning. It had been brewing for years, only now he dared to speak it into words. Clarice had been, for too long, the family's invisible support. She paid the mortgage on the apartment, the electricity bills, Viviane's health plan, and even her granddaughter Sophia's school fees. At the bank, the automatic transfers bore the same names: Bernardo, rent; Viviane, credit card; Sophia, lessons. She said it was temporary, that as soon as her son's work prospered, everything would balance out. But the months turned into years, and the promise became a habit. Even so, every Sunday she arrived with her lemon cake, smiled, and pretended not to notice the silence with which it was received. Clarice thought that love sustained everything. She didn't yet know that love, when it is one-sided, can also be exhausting. That Tuesday after the message, Clarice turned off her cell phone and stared at the pot as if she could find an answer at the bottom of the candy. She didn't cry. Perhaps because she had already cried so much in silence that her tears had dried up somewhere along the way. She walked to the living room and sat by the window. Outside, the day continued as normal. Cars passed by, a neighbor watered the plants, the baker waved from the corner. Nothing in the world reflected her breakdown. On the dining room table, there was an unfinished rag doll, the one she was sewing for Sophia's birthday. She looked at it with a mixture of tenderness and exhaustion. For the first time, she didn't feel like following her. She understood that that doll was the summary of her life, always giving something that others didn't want to receive. She remembered the day Viviane arrived with her suitcases to the small apartment Bernardo was renting. She welcomed them with a simple dinner of baked chicken and garlic rice. They smiled, hugged, and talked about plans and the future. At that moment, Clarice felt part of something. "We are a family," her son had said, and that word was enough for her to open her savings account and help them with the deposit on their new apartment. Then came the mortgage, the furniture, the car, the granddaughter's uniforms, and every gesture of help gradually became an obligation. If she ever doubted her commitment, she only had to remember Sophia's smile or Bernardo's tiredness. Clarice didn't know how to say no without feeling guilty. She was a woman accustomed to mending, not breaking. Over time, family Sundays grew quieter. Clarice would arrive early, set the table, make coffee, and watch as her son and daughter-in-law argued in low voices about money. She pretended not to hear, though each word hit her like a needle. One afternoon, while cutting the cake, she heard Viviane say, "Your mother is living like a queen with our help." Bernardo didn't respond. He just kept staring at his cell phone. Clarice swallowed her anger along with a piece of dough. That phrase would stay with her for months, even after no one remembered it. That was the first thread that began to unravel inside her, the subtle warning that something in her relationship with her son was breaking beyond repair. In recent years, Clarice had begun to notice small gestures that hurt her more than any words. Vivian stopped inviting her to Sophia's school events. Bernardo avoided telling her his plans, and conversations in the family group were reduced to messages about payments or favors. She still woke up early, checked her account balance, and made transfers before her first coffee. She did it automatically, like someone fulfilling a sacred duty. But each click weighed more heavily on her. Something like fatigue was beginning to appear in her heart, a new shadow that wasn't sadness, but the certainty that she was sustaining a life that no longer included her. One winter night, Clarice overheard a conversation that wasn't meant for her. Bernardo was talking on the phone on the balcony, thinking her mother was asleep. He said something that left her breathless. "I don't know what to do with her, Vivian. She's becoming a dead weight." The phrase bounced around in her head like an endless echo. Clarice, from the hallway, felt her whole body tense. She put her hand to her chest, not from physical pain, but from that invisible shock that only disappointment can give. She quietly returned to her room and sat down on her bed. That night she didn't sleep. She watched the shadows of the furniture, listened to the ticking of the clock, and realized she had raised someone who no longer saw love, only usefulness. The next morning, she got up before dawn. She made coffee, combed her hair, and went out into the yard. The cool air cleared her mind. She remembered her husband's words many years ago when he was still alive. "Never let habit make you invisible, Clarice." In that moment, that phrase took on new meaning. She promised herself that even if it hurt, she wouldn't continue financing her own absence. She went back inside and took out of a drawer a blue folder where she kept receipts, transfers, and vouchers. It was everything she had given without asking for anything. She looked at the pile of papers and, for the first time, saw not sacrifice, but proof. Something inside her was beginning to change, even if she didn't yet know how to use this new power. In the following days, Clarice began to organize her house with a strange, almost methodical calm. She separated documents, classified receipts, and labeled them with dates and amounts. Each receipt was a memory. The mortgage loan, Sophia's license plate, Bernardo's car repair. Each one bore her name, her effort, her love. But now she looked at them from a distance, as if they belonged to someone else. She realized she had turned her affection into a kind of emotional wage that others gratefully collected. That blue folder began to have a different value. It was no longer just a file. It was a testimony. Clarice didn't know it, but on those pages she was writing the first line of her liberation. That weekend, while baking another lemon cake no one had asked for, Clarice turned on the television and let the noise fill the empty house. She thought of all the women she knew, friends, neighbors, cousins, who had gone through the same thing without ever telling anyone. And maybe if you're reading this now, you can recognize someone, or even yourself, in this story. If so, tell me where you're listening from, because there are many silent Clarices who deserve to be heard. Meanwhile, she turned off the oven and looked at herself in the reflection of the microwave. She was no longer the same woman who once believed that love meant paying all the bills without asking for respect in return. The following Monday, Clarice decided to visit Dr. Henrique, an old friend of her late husband's who now worked as a lawyer. She carried the blue folder under her arm, her heart pounding. She didn't know if she was looking for justice or simply understanding. Henrique greeted her with a kind gesture, listened silently, and leafed through the documents attentively. When she finished, he looked up and said, "Clarice, you have everything here. Not just receipts, but proof of an entire life dedicated to them." She didn't respond, but a tear escaped without permission. For the first time in a long time, someone saw the weight of her dedication not as exaggeration, but as evidence. As she left the office, she took a deep breath. Something in her back straightened, as if she had stopped carrying an invisible suitcase. That night at home, Clarice poured herself a bowl of soup and ate dinner alone in silence. It wasn't sadness she felt. It was a new calm, a clarity she hadn't felt in years. She turned on her phone and saw the family group. The recent messages were from Vivian, photos of Sophia at school, heart stickers, conversations without her name. No one had asked how she was. She closed the app, turned off her phone, and put it in a drawer. For the first time, she didn't feel guilty about disconnecting. While washing the dishes, she thought that maybe silence could also be an answer. The days grew longer, but Clarice didn't write in the group again. She spent her time on small tasks, mending a curtain, sewing buttons, watering the plants. These simple routines kept her grounded. Every so often, she looked at her phone, not to wait for a message, but to check that her resolve remained firm. And it was. She had spent her entire life solving other people's problems, and now she had to learn to support herself. In the silence, thoughts she hadn't allowed herself to have before began to appear. What she would do with her money, how to redecorate the house, even whether she wanted to travel again someday. It was like discovering a room in her life that had always been locked. One afternoon, she received an unexpected call. It was Sophia, her granddaughter. The girl, with her sweet and curious voice, asked why she hadn't been over lately. Clarice swallowed and told her she was a little tired, that she would see her soon. She didn't want to speak ill of anyone or blame her son. She hung up the phone and remained silent for a few minutes, her heart heavy. She understood that this was the hardest part of her decision, not being able to protect the only person who still saw her with sincere love. But she also knew that, if she didn't set limits now, Sophia would one day learn that affection is measured by what one gives, not by who one is. After that call, Clarice felt a new emptiness, different from loneliness. It was a mix of nostalgia and pride. She knew the distance hurt, but also that it was necessary. The next day, she went to the bank and canceled the automatic transfers. The employee looked at her in surprise when Clarice explained that she would no longer be helping her son financially. "Are you sure, ma'am?" she asked. She nodded with a serenity she herself hadn't expected. As she left the bank, the fresh air hit her face, and she felt light. For the first time in years, the money left in her account was hers alone. It wasn't wealth, it was freedom. The following weeks were an exercise in endurance. Bernardo didn't call at first, but Vivian did. She wrote short messages. "Mom, he forgot to pay the gas bill. The school fee is missing." Clarice read them all and didn't respond. She deleted the family group and went on with her day. On the third try, the silence began to make noise on the other end. It was then that she understood something simple but powerful. Sometimes, love is demonstrated more by a firm absence than by a surrendered presence. As she made a coffee, she smiled slightly. Not because she was happy, but because she was alive again, feeling something of her own. Bernardo finally called one Saturday afternoon. His voice sounded tense, almost irritated. He asked if she'd had any problems with the bank, as if the cut-off transfers were a technical error. Clarice calmly replied, "No, son. I decided to stop." The silence that followed spoke louder than any shout. He hung up without saying goodbye. Clarice stared at the phone for a few seconds, but felt no guilt. She knew that every word she didn't say was a seed of respect she was planting for herself. She poured herself some tea, turned on the radio, and continued folding clothes without drama, without tears. It was the everyday sound of a woman who finally had said enough. Over the following weeks, Bernardo's world began to crumble. The bank called to warn him about overdue payments, Sophia's school demanded payment, and Vivian began to show her discomfort. Clarice didn't immediately realize it, but the signs came from neighbors and acquaintances. Arguments in the hallway, shouts behind the door. Meanwhile, she serenely maintained her routine. She went to the market, cooked, sewed. Not out of indifference, but because she had understood that grief also needs space to mature. Whenever she thought of her son, it was with a mixture of sadness and hope, like someone looking at a garden knowing that some flowers only grow after hard pruning. A month later, Bernardo appeared at his mother's door. He carried no flowers or gifts, just a tired face and a broken voice. "Mom, I need to talk," he said, without looking directly into her eyes. Clarice let him in. They sat at their usual table, the one where they had so often shared coffee and silence. He explained between pauses that Viviane had left him, that debts were drowning him, that he didn't know how to go on. Clarice listened without interrupting, her hands clasped on the tablecloth. She felt no revenge, no pleasure, only a sad compassion, the kind that doesn't seek to console, but to understand. When he finished, she served him some tea and said, "Now you know what it feels like to carry everything." Bernardo looked down. He looked younger and older at the same time. He apologized, stammering, his tears catching in his throat. Clarice took a deep breath before answering. "I don't need your apologies, son, just for you to learn." The words came out softly, but firmly. For a moment, silence enveloped them, and they both knew that something had definitely broken, but also something was being repaired. Bernardo, for the first time in his adult life, didn't ask for money. He only asked to stay a while. Clarice nodded. They shared the same tea, and although the past wasn't erased, the air in the house regained a bit of humanity. During that visit, Clarice realized she was no longer the same woman who had raised him in fear of disappointing him. Her voice sounded different, slower, more confident. Bernardo looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time, and that look moved her more than any apology. They spoke little, but it was enough for both of them to understand that the love between them was not dead, only exhausted from so much unequal burden. When he left a jar of pumpkin jam on the table, the same one she used to make when he was a child. Clarice took it in her hands, smelled it, and felt that this simple offering was worth more than all the empty messages from the family group. That night, Clarice opened the jar and tried a spoonful. The taste reminded her of the years when everything was simpler, the patio with the sheets drying in the sun, the sound of Bernardo's tricycle, the scent of coconut soap on her hands. She didn't cry. She smiled with a new serenity, knowing that although she couldn't go back, she could still recover something of herself. She washed the spoon, turned off the lights, and went to bed early. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, but inside that house a different silence had fallen, not one of abandonment, but of rest. As the days passed, Clarice began to notice small changes within herself. She woke up with more energy, prepared her breakfast without looking at her phone, and even started listening to music. Again, while she sewed, she rediscovered songs she had stopped listening to when everything revolved around her family. Every detail, no matter how small, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, the sun shining through the window, the threads slipping through her fingers, became a form of reconciliation with herself. The loneliness no longer weighed so heavily. It had begun to transform into a space of calm. For the first time in a long time, Clarice felt in control of her days. One Friday afternoon, while shopping for fruit at the market, she ran into a neighbor she hadn't seen in years. "Clarice, you look different, more alive," she said, surprised. She smiled, acknowledged the compliment, and continued on her way. That simple comment confirmed what she'd already sensed. Her change was visible. When she got home, she placed the oranges on the table and looked at herself in the kitchen mirror. She wasn't the same tired woman who expected scraps of attention. She was someone who had learned that true love isn't measured in sacrifice, but in respect. That certainty, silent but firm, became her new companion. Over time, Bernardo visited her again. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a beginning. He arrived unannounced, his voice low and his shoulders slumped. He brought stories about how he was trying to reorganize his life, find a job, and regain Sofia's trust. Clarice listened to him without interrupting, offering only a cup of tea or a piece of bread. She had stopped, advising him. She understood that love also knows how to be silent. She watched him while he spoke and thought about how many years she had spent trying to rescue someone who had never learned to swim. Now she let him do it, even if it meant watching him stumble again. The afternoons were filled with a new routine: sewing, soft music, and the sound of birds outside the window. Clarice opened her sewing machine again, the one she had abandoned due to lack of time and energy. She began making rag dolls to sell at the local fair, more out of pleasure than necessity. Each stitch was a way to recover something that emotional exhaustion had stolen from her, the feeling of creating. In a short time, her table was filled with colorful fabrics, ribbons, and needles. Her house, which had once smelled of tiredness and sleeplessness, now smelled of new thread and hope. One morning, while organizing her dolls to take to the fair, Clarice received a call from Sofia's school. The girl had told her teacher that she missed her grandmother, and the school thought it would be nice to invite her to an end-of-year event. Clarice hesitated for a few seconds, but accepted. That afternoon, when she arrived, the girl ran up to her and hugged her tightly. Bernardo, sitting in the back row, watched her silently, his eyes moist. Clarice felt that hug was worth more than any apology. She didn't need words or explanations. That small gesture reassured her that, even if love becomes distorted, it never completely disappears. After the ceremony, Clarice returned home with a mixture of emotions difficult to name. She left her purse on the chair and stood for a few minutes, staring at her wrinkled hands. She thought about everything she had lost, but also about what she had gained: respect, serenity, independence. She had learned to say no without hating herself for it. That night, as she sewed a new doll with scraps of blue fabric, she felt a peace she hadn't felt in decades. She understood that her story was not one of abandonment, but of rebirth, and that her silence, which she had once felt was punishment, had become her most dignified way of speaking. As the months passed, Clarice became a familiar figure at the neighborhood fair. Many would stop in front of her stand just to chat. They asked her how she managed to sew so evenly, how she made the dolls seem alive. She would reply with a smile, "Because each one carries a little piece of what I left." Her story began to circulate among the neighbors, and some older women would come forward to share theirs. Without realizing it, Clarice had become a small beacon for others who had also been invisible in their own families. She was a silent web woven of needles, threads, and understanding. One afternoon, while she was putting away the dolls at the end of the day, Bernardo appeared at the fair. He didn't say anything at first. He walked among the stalls, watching his mother smile at the customers. When he reached her, he bought a doll without asking the price. "It's for Sofia," he said quietly. Clarice nodded. He helped her pack the boxes and walked her home. The walk was peaceful, without reproaches or excuses. Upon arrival, they shared a cup of coffee in silence. That scene, so simple, carried enormous weight. It was confirmation that, even if bonds are stretched to the point of pain, if there is true love, they are never completely broken. That night, After Bernardo left, Clarice stared out the window. The neighborhood lights flickered, and for the first time, she didn't feel sad thinking about her son. She loved him, yes, but not with the same weight as before. Now she loved him from a distance, with respect. Deep down, she understood that sometimes love requires silence to cleanse itself of fear and resentment. She poured herself a cup of warm milk and promised herself never to carry anything that wasn't hers again. That promise, so simple, was actually the most important of her life. The following days were calm, almost peaceful. Bernardo continued to visit her occasionally, but their relationship had changed. There were no more pleas or dependencies, only brief, sincere conversations. Clarice felt that little by little, they were learning to know each other again, not as mother and son who owe each other something, but as two people who choose each other without demands. Sophia also visited her, helping her decorate the dolls and laughing innocently. In those moments, Clarice understood that her decision had been worth it, because sometimes, to win back those we love, we must first lose them a little. Winter arrived, and with it, a calm Clarice couldn't remember feeling in years. The cold afternoons were filled with the steady sound of her sewing machine, the aroma of coffee, and the old radio broadcasting boleros. She no longer waited for calls, messages, or apologies. Everything she'd needed to say, she'd said with his silence. One night, as she placed a blanket over her legs, she realized she wasn't thinking about the past with pain, but with gratitude. Those years of sacrifice had been her schooling. Thanks to them, she now knew who she was and what she was worth. A neighbor invited her to teach a small sewing workshop at the community center. At first, Clarice hesitated, but accepted. Within a few days, she found herself surrounded by women searching for the same thing she had found, a reason to continue, something that made them feel useful. She shared techniques, but also stories, advice, and silences. Between threads and needles, a supportive community was born, the kind that is built without plans, only with the need for support. Clarice understood that her story hadn't ended with her son's message. A new chapter had just begun, one where love wasn't begged for. It was shared. One Sunday, while making tea for her students, Clarice turned on the television and heard a story similar to her own. A woman was talking about how she found her life after being forgotten by her own family. Clarice smiled tenderly. She knew she wasn't alone. And if you're reading or listening to this now, perhaps you know someone who also needs a sign like that. Share it, because sometimes a shared story can be the first step toward healing. In her living room, Clarice felt that her former silence had transformed into a voice, a calm voice that now helped others not to give up. That night, Bernardo called her just to check on her. He didn't ask for anything, didn't complain, just wanted to chat. They talked about the weather, about Sophia, about the fair. It was a short conversation, but different, without weight, without debts. Clarice hung up with a calm smile. She understood that mature love doesn't always require grand gestures, but rather respect, time, and distance. She went to bed with a light heart, grateful for the journey. Outside, the rain was beginning to fall, each drop sounding like a gentle reminder that even the harshest storms can leave a clear air in their wake. As the months passed, Clarice's life took on a rhythm of its own, serene, uneventful. Her dolls began to sell well, and she even received orders from other cities. The small workshop at the community center grew so much that she was asked to teach regular Saturday classes. She accepted, not for the money, but because teaching gave her back that sense of purpose she had lost so long ago. In every stitch she showed, she also spoke of the importance of boundaries, of not letting love become a burden. The women listened attentively, knowing that behind her firm hands lay a story of silent resilience. One afternoon, Bernardo and Sophia went to visit her at the workshop. The little girl ran to hug her, while her father looked at the tables full of fabrics and smiles. "It's beautiful, Mom," he said with a pride Clarice hadn't expected. She offered him a seat, and the three of them shared a mate amid soft laughter and memories. It wasn't a miracle that had happened, but it had been a sincere reconciliation. Clarice understood that love, once it's healed, doesn't need to be the same again. It just needs to be real. As they said goodbye, Bernardo hugged her for a long time without words, and she, for the first time in a long time, allowed herself to believe that it had all been worth it. A few years passed, and Clarice aged with dignity and peace. Her hair turned completely white, but her hands remained steady, guiding the threads and stitching. Everyone in the neighborhood already knew her as Doña Clarice of the Dolls. Her students, many of them older women, considered her a friend, almost a confidant. She listened to them without judgment, because she knew what it was like to feel alone and used. On cold evenings, she used to make pumpkin jam to share with the group, the same jam that had witnessed her pain and her awakening. Now its scent no longer evoked sadness, but home. One morning, Bernardo arrived with a tray covered with a cloth. He placed it on the table and, with a shy smile, uncovered a lemon tart. Clarice looked at it and instantly understood the message. He too had learned to give without expecting anything. They ate together, laughing, as they hadn't done for years. As they said goodbye, she said in a calm voice, "It's not pride, Bernardo. It's dignity." When the door closed, Clarice watched the sun enter through the window, illuminating her dolls, the table, and the blue folder. She had gone from sacrifice to respect, from imposed silence to chosen silence, and in that silence, she finally found peace.